Dear students, good morning. This is the class for Asia e Africa 1 for March the 24th. So let's see what we did yesterday quickly. We were talking about different varieties of English and how they conjugate verbs. Actually, the main characteristic of these varieties is that they tend not to be conjugated. So this means that, for instance, the third person singular is not marked. You're likely going to hear something like she drink milk, or every microcosm consists of many cells. Something that is also related to verbs, the use of verbs, is that there is a limited use of past tense. For instance, with Mandarin, I learn it privately, where they wanted to indicate a past tense. Okay, and there's also this difference between how these varieties use aspect rather than tense systems. What do I mean? That, for instance, they use I still eat for I am eating, or I was eating. Okay. And something that is considered a mistake also in the inner circle, in languages that are learning English as an L2, is the use of be plus a continuous form for stated verbs. She is knowing her English very well. Okay. And we looked at the creation of phrasal verbs and prepositional verbs that are quite productive in these languages, like I'm going to voice out my opinion. Another aspect that we looked at were how question tags are used, and we said that every country has its own specific or more typical question tag, like India uses no or not so for East and West Africa, or is it for Singapore and Malaysia. The language we focused on for Monday's class is Tagalog, okay, and the variety of English that is used in the Philippines, so Taglish. We watched some videos about that, and we focused on this concept of speaking English means that you're intelligent. Speaking fluent English is that you are means that you are intelligent. Okay, so how the improper use of English is stigmatized in these countries still. We watched this other video about the comparison between Filipino English and American English, specifically about vocabulary and some cultural differences. And we watched this video about some 14 differences between the Philippines and the world. This was more, let's say, from a cultural point of view than for a language. And I think I'd like to add more of these videos that are about the countries that we are discussing, because otherwise it's just you don't have concrete reference. You don't know what countries you're actually talking about. Even just a video is fine. It gets you connected to what you are studying. So I'll add those videos here and there. Then we started talking about vocabulary and how new words are formed in these varieties of English. Some cases are just add prefixes or suffixes to English words. I gave you the case of stingo, stinkco, for something that is smelly in colloquial Singapore English. Okay, or spacey and heady, that add the suffix y to create a new adjective. Then we looked at the fact of compounding, the phenomenon of compounding, where usually a local concept is explained through English words. So, for instance, a peelhead in Jamaican English is a bald-headed person, or a dining leaf in Indian English is usually a banana, lotus, or another leaf that is used as a plate. Finally, another phenomenon that can occur is just plain borrowings from the indigenous languages. It's for this reason that in East African English, you can hear words like chai, duka, manaba for laborer, or in Indian English, Swadeshi for indigenous, native or homegrown, and for Philippine English, kundiman for love song, just to name a few. Then, last video I think that we watched for that video, for that song, that class, was an introduction to No Such a Thing as Correct English, in which this scholar shows us focused on the concept of non-standard English and how these varieties of English actually do have patterns. Okay, we looked at the pattern of habitual be that could be interpreted as an incorrect use of the verb to be, but is actually indicating something that usually occurs. So there is a pattern. The basics, the underlining idea of this video was that simply language changes and that probably there is no such a thing as a standard English, but language evolves with the people who use it. And then now, as for today's class, we're going to talk about idioms, idiomatic expressions. In these cases, most of these idioms were born from learners' unsuccessful attempts to use the idioms of native speakers of English. So what happened? In some cases, idioms in these varieties of English are just direct translations from the indigenous idioms. It is for this reason that in Singapore or Malaysian English, to shake legs means to be idle. And this comes from the Malay idiom that I don't even try to pronounce, goyang kaki, if anybody is studying any of these languages, of the local languages, of course, you can correct me, please do. And this means to be idle. In other cases, these idioms are based on native speaker English. For instance, in East African, to be on the tarmac means to be in the process of seeking a new job. I'll go back to this word tarmac because I don't remember honestly what it means literally. So, first step, they're direct translations from the indigenous idioms. In other cases, they are the opposite. They're based on the native speaker English idioms. In other cases, they can be a combination of English with the indigenous forms. For instance, in Nigerian, to put sand in someone's gari means to threaten someone's livelihood, because gari is a type of flour that is used in Nigeria. So if you put sand in their gari, you are threatening their lives. And finally, it can also occur that there is some sort of variation on the English idioms. For instance, in British English, you say to have your cake and eat it too, which is more or less the equivalent of avere la moglie ubriaca e la botte piena. That becomes in Singapore English to eat your cake and have it. Okay, so it changes the English idiom. Or the Singapore English one idiom is to be in hot soup. And this blends two idioms, two British English idioms, that is to be in hot water and to be in the soup. So what the Singapore English wants to say is that they are in trouble. So basically you can see that also with idioms that are a higher expression that goes beyond the literal meaning of words, there's also always creation, be it direct translation from the indigenous languages or some that are based on English, others that combine them, or others that even combine two English idioms. Okay, they're very productive. Moving forward to discourse style. You have to consider that new Englishes, or post-colonial Englishes, are definitely more formal than inner circle Englishes. Probably you've all received some sort of scam, no, from these countries, and you can definitely, even if you didn't know the characteristics, you can realize that they were scam. In case you didn't know, somebody from those countries, of course, I was just giving you the example of scam because it's the first thing that came up to my mind. If you don't know anybody from these countries, you notice a high level of formality. Let's look at Indian English, okay? Not necessarily a scam, just let me correct myself. If you receive a letter from somebody who lives in India, who speaks Indian English, you are definitely going to notice that they have a higher level of formality compared to inner circle speakers of English. You will notice that the words could and would are definitely more used in Indian English than in British English. In many cases, British English uses can and will, where Indian English uses could and would. For instance, Indian English could say something like, "We hope that you could join us," or "We hope that the Vice Chancellor would investigate this matter." Where British English would say, "We hope that you can join us," or "We hope that the Vice Chancellor will investigate the matter. Okay? Sorry if you hear any sounds in the background. Another aspect that you might notice is called deferential vocabulary. What does this mean? Okay? They are very formal and perhaps they would use blessings. That could seem a little redundant and awkward for a speaker of an inner circle English person. Like, "I am bubbling with zeal and enthusiasm to serve as a research assistant." Okay, might seem a little weird to an inner circle English speaker, but it's quite common. This type of deferential vocabulary is very common in other varieties in post-colonial Englishes. I'll skip this part because I don't remember what it was referring to. Um, yeah, let's just skip this. So not only will you find more formality at the beginning or within the body of a text, but there's also more formality and differences with leave takings. In Lankan English, you would hear something like, I'll go and come, or Singaporean Malaysian English, walk slowly ho. Okay, so there are also some differences at the general level, the discourse style. Okay. Now let's move on to something that one of you, I remember her name, Anita, I don't remember her last name, asked further information about. We're going to get into this chapter about the difference between Pidgin and Creole languages, what they are, and how they developed. First thing first, let's look at how they developed. According to this scholar, Leith, in 1996, identified 3 types of English colonies. In what is now in the Americas and Australia, what happened was that the first language speakers of English basically displaced the pre-colonial population. Okay? Remember about what happened in what is now the United States with the Native Americans. Nigeria. What happened here? Part of the population was kept, of the pre-colonial population, of course, of the local population, if you want, was put in subjection by the English colonial settlers. And part of this pre-colonial population was allowed to learn English as a second or additional language. And this is the case of Nigeria and other African countries. Then Caribbean. What happened in the Caribbean islands of Barbados and Jamaica? In this case, the pre-colonial population was even replaced by new labor forces that came from somewhere else, principally from West Africa. Okay, remember what we said about the diaspora when people from West Africa were enslaved and brought to this area of the Caribbean islands. Okay, so let me repeat. In some cases, English speakers totally displaced the pre-colonial population. In other cases, the pre-colonial population was put into subjection, and part of them learned English. In other cases, such as in the Caribbean, the pre-colonial population was replaced by people coming from somewhere else, principally West Africa. Now, I'll try to explain further the difference between Pidgin and Creole. So you have to think that a Pidgin is a language with no native speakers. So it's nobody's first language. It was born as a contact language. There was the aim, 2 populations had to communicate, they didn't know how. They created a mix of the 2 languages. But there is no such a thing as a first language speaker of a pigeon. But in a second moment, after many years, this pigeon transforms into something else. It becomes a Creole. When it becomes the first language of a new generation of speakers. Okay? When a new generation is born that uses pidgin as their first language, it is called a Creole. In these cases, what happens? These pigeons tend to simplify the original language. They simplify, English. Or whatever whatever the two languages of contact were. First thing is they avoid grammatical redundancy. So the two big newspapers, les deux grands journaux, in Cameroon pidgin becomes Dinu Big Pepa. Okay, sorry for the interruption. So not only pidgin, Creole, but what can happen even further later on down the language process is also a phenomenon called decreolization. What happens is basically that the Creole, so people who speak what was once a pidgin as their mother tongues, gets into an extensive contact with the dominant language. What does this mean? Get the example of African American Vernacular English, that is also known as AAVE, also called Ebonics. Okay, in this case, the Creole came into contact with the dominant language, with English. Now, this African American Vernacular English phenomenon is very important to analyze. Okay? We are talking about the African American community within the United States. So now I want you to pause this video and watch this first video called Lessons from Lucy Laney, African American Vernacular English. And it gives you an experience, a direct experience of how, of what happens to African American Vernacular English in certain American schools, and how it is important to get into the process of code switching. Okay, so please pause this video. The first video that I asked you to watch lasts about 7 minutes. Okay, so the aspects that I want you to focus on for this video were this stigma, this idea of this variety of English as broken English, okay, and how this can interfere with success, social, educational, political success of these very young students. What they are trying to teach these kids is code switching. And as Italians, we do it all the time. Remember that with code switching, you know when to use dialect and when to use standard Italian, okay? So they want to teach them where and how to use different varieties. And the last part of the video was about this teacher's experience on reading books in vernacular English, in African American vernacular English, because these teachers wanted to understand the difficulties that these young students encounter when they have to learn standard American English. Second video that I want you to watch on African American vernacular English is a little more technical, and it's about the linguistics of AAVE. This video gives you some ideas on the origins of AAVE and some patterns. So please pause this video and go to link number 2, which is about 8 minutes. So the first part of the video discussed the origins of AAVE and on whether it was born from a divergence or a totally separate origin. Some interesting phenomena that the video discussed was some pronunciation patterns, such as the th or the, that are pronounced differently, and that there are some patterns when it seems that apparently this variety does not have patterns, but it actually does. And the video gave you some examples of how, where in standard American English contractions are used, what happens, interestingly, in AAVE is dropping. Okay, so you drop the parts that are usually contracted in standard English. Plus, the use of double negatives. However, what happens is that while some Creoles are moving more and more towards standard English, on the other hand, in some areas of the world, with young speakers especially, what was once a decreolized Creole, okay, meaning that it got into contact with the dominant language, a Creole that that changed because it got more into contact with the dominant language, shows signs of moving back to Creole. This happens in some areas, in some particularly multicultural areas in the world. And this is something that is happening with multicultural London. Before we get into Jafaican and MLE, don't remember, multicultural London English, I want you to watch this first video that gives you an introduction to the multicultural aspects of London. It's just an introduction. It's 5 minutes. So pause the video and watch what you can find at link number 3. Okay, so we're back. You saw that the three main cultures that you can find in London are Indians, Pakistanis, and Jamaicans. Let's talk about something that is going on from a linguistic point of view in London. Young people are talking something, using a language that is now known as Jafaican, a sort of British-based patois, where Jafaican means fake Jamaican. That was also known as London Jamaican. This very short video is just a mockery, but it gives you an idea of what some people would sound like. And that's point 4. Not a serious video, but it gives you an idea. More seriously, I want you to watch these other 2 videos that show you, this is point 5, sorry. Sorry for making you go back and forth like this with videos, but it's the best way to do this. I want you to watch this other video, about 11 minutes, that is about multicultural London English, or actually Jafaican, and how young populations are using this. The younger speakers are using this, this multicultural London English, even without realizing it. And they only notice it when they talk, when they're communicating with older generations. Okay. And then finally, last video that I think I have for you today, something a little more relaxed about Papa Teach English. We watched some of his videos in class about Cockney and how to speak like a real Londoner. So he gets into phonetics, some vocabulary, and some syntax patterns. So see if you can if you enjoy this other video that lasts about 8 minutes. Okay, no, I lied. There's another link, sorry, but we'll do that later. Going back to the descriptions of Pidgin and Creoles. Before, we talked about how they spread. Now, we're going to look at the origin of the term Pidgin. According to the scholar Suzanne Roman, who wrote about this already in 1988, there are 5 probably, the word Pidgin has, let's say, 5 probable origins. According to one theory, the word pigeon is actually a Chinese corruption of the English word business. For instance, Gos Pigeon Man, God businessman, means priest. Okay, so it probably derives from the word business. Another probable Chinese explanation is another probable explanation is that it derives from a Chinese corruption of the Portuguese word ocupação, business. A little weird. I don't see this relation, but okay. Or from the Hebrew word pidgam, which means barter, exchange, trade, okay? So as you can see, they all have to deal with the concept of business, of exchanging. Another explanation could be the word pidian, I suppose. That means people in Yago, which is a South American Indian language spoken in an area that was colonized by Great Britain. And finally, those of you who study Chinese, please forgive me. It can derive from, I'll just read them literally, from the two characters pei and cin, meaning paying money. Okay. If there's anybody that is learning Chinese and wants to drop the IPA for this in one of the comments, I'd highly appreciate that. But anyway, as you can see, all these 5 explanations come from the concept of trading. Okay, business, money. Now, other theories try to explain where pigeon came from, and there are several theories. One theory is called the independent parallel development theory. What does this mean? According to this theory, all pigeons and creoles developed independently. But they are similar in a way because they all have a common linguistic ancestor. They all have an Indo-European origin. So even though they were born separately, they still share some aspects. They're all similar because they all derive from the Indo-European languages. Number 2, the nautical jargon theory. According to this theory, pigeons and creoles were born when European sailors from all around Europe had a sort of lingua franca that they used to communicate with other sailors from other countries. Then, this lingua franca was passed on to the African and Asian peoples when they got to their countries. Then there's this third theory that has quite an impressive and threatening description. The theory of monogenesis and relexification. What does this mean? According to this theory, all the pigeons and creoles that were born in Europe derive from one proto-pigeon source. They all derive from one pigeon, basically. That is, a Portuguese pigeon that was used for trading during the 15th and 16th century. Okay, monogenesis, they were born all from one pigeon. Relexification, meaning that then they had different lives and they used different words, but the origin is always the same. According to this theory, this Portuguese pigeon derived from an earlier lingua franca that was called sabir. And this was used by crusaders, I crociati, and traders in the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages. So this saber came into contact with Portuguese. Portuguese lexis was introduced into saber. And then this pigeon was used by the Portuguese in the 15th century once they started sailing along the coast of West Africa. And then for theory, the baby talk theory. So what does this theory say? Pigeons work like baby talk. So they have lots of content words with meanings. They don't have structural words, or at least there's less than standard English. They don't use morphological changes. Remember what I told you about all the S's and the tenses. And there's a sort of approximation with standard pronunciation. Okay, so baby talk theory basically means that it's like a simplified language. So reviewing these theories. According to the first theory, pigeons and creoles all developed independently, but they all have an Indo-European origin. According to the second theory, they all come from a European sailor's lingua franca that was passed on to the African and Asian peoples when they came into contact with them. Monogenesis, they all come from this Portuguese pigeon that in turn derived from an earlier lingua franca called sabir that was used during the Middle Ages. Then, when the Portuguese started sailing in the 15th century to the West African coast, they brought that pigeon with them. And finally, the baby talk theory that focuses more on the fact that pigeons are similar to how children learn to talk. So lots of content words, less grammar, less morphological change, and approximation of pronunciation. Finally, there's this last thesis that makes everybody happy, that establishes that basically pigeons and creoles are a synthesis of all the first four concepts. So remember that a pigeon is a language with no native speakers that was born because there was no lingua franca that the two populations shared. It's a language of contact that was born for certain necessities, limited amount of necessities. And once the second generation is born and they start speaking pidgin as the mother tongue, it's no longer called a pidgin, but it's called a creole. Hope that was not too confusing. So to sum up and to give you further information, I invite you to watch this last video about pigeons and creoles, link number 7. That is about 10 minutes and summarizes more or less all the things that we've said so far. Okay, so what did we do for today? We looked at idioms and how these can be translated or borrowed or mixed from several languages. We looked at discourse style, and I said that generally speaking, post-colonial Englishes are more formal than inner circle Englishes, and I gave you the examples from some Indian letters. And we studied more thoroughly the difference between Pidgin and Creole languages. We looked at different types of colonies, so where in some cases, like in the United States, in America, The local communities were displaced by by English speakers. In some cases, the population was put into slavery, and a portion of it was allowed to learn English as a second language. Or cases like in the Caribbean, where the pre-colonial population was replaced by new labor that came generally from West Africa. We looked at the difference between Pidgin and Creole, okay? Language with no speakers for the first case, the language that has become the first language of a new generation of speakers for the second, and how it generally simplifies several phenomena. We also looked at the fact, the process of decreolization, where a Creole comes into contact, into extensive contact with the dominant language. And so we looked at the case of African American Vernacular English and the problems that are surfacing when these children get into the educational system, and how to fight discrimination. We looked at some patterns of AAVE, and so we said that it is not broken English, because actually it does have patterns. We also looked at the opposite phenomenon, where there is cases of Creoles, of decreolized Creoles, that are going back to Creole. And we looked at the cases of multicultural London, where young generations are using this patois Jamaican even without realizing it. And finally, we looked at the origins of the term pidgin, and we basically said that they all have to do with the word business. Probably I explained too much today. If it was too much, I'll slow down next time. We looked at the origins of pigeons and how they were born. Generally speaking, there are these four theories that all think that they have a sort of they all come from the Indo-European languages. Last thing for today, our song, and the song for today is Chandelier. So I'll read the lyrics. Party girls, don't get hurt. Can't feel anything. When will I learn? I push it down, push it down. I'm the one for a good time call. The phone's blowing up, ringing my doorbell. I feel the love, fear the love. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, drink. And then it repeats. Throw him back till I lose count. I'm gonna swing from the chandelier, I'm gonna live like tomorrow doesn't exist, like it doesn't exist. I'm gonna fly like a bird through the night, feel my tears as they dry. I'm gonna swing from the chandelier. But I'm holding on for dear life. Won't look down, won't open my eyes. Keep my glass full until morning light, 'cause I'm just gonna hold on for tonight. Help me, I'm holding on for dear life. Won't look down, won't open my eyes. Keep my glass full until morning light, 'cause I'm just holding on for tonight, holding on for tonight. Sun is up. I'm a mess. Gotta get out now, gotta run from this. Here comes the shame, here comes the shame. It repeats. And then it repeats. So I left the link over here, and then I'll put it in the description box below. So thank you for watching, and please let me know if you have any questions. I think I went a little too fast, lots of notions for today, so I'll catch up for next time. Thank you very much, and see you next time on next Monday. at 8:30. Have a nice day. Bye.